In Sussex County, Virginia, there's a hill of sand that a company has been digging up and selling by the truckload. It sits above the Nottoway River, covered in prickly pear cactus, which is how it got its name. And somewhere inside that hill, buried in loose sand, were stone blades that shouldn't have been there. The only thing separating them from everything American archaeology believed was a few inches of dirt. Almost nobody outside archaeology has heard of Cactus Hill. That's strange, because for about 25 years, it's been one of the 2 or 3 most important arguments in the field. It's not a cave, it's not a rock shelter, it's a sand dune. And sand is the problem. Sand is loose. Sand moves. Things fall through it. If you want to convince the scientific establishment that you found something older than everyone believes possible, a sand dune is close to the worst place on Earth to make that case, which is exactly where 2 separate teams found it. The man who did most of the work was Joseph McAvoy. Not a university professor. He ran something called the Nottoway River Survey, and he'd spent years walking that stretch of Virginia River country, recording sites, mapping what was there. Meticulous, patient, and outside the system, which mattered enormously in what came next. When McAvoy began digging seriously into that dune in the early 1990s, the rule in American archaeology was absolute. The first people on this continent were the Clovis hunters, who arrived around 13,000 years ago, carrying a distinctive fluted spear point. Beneath the Clovis layer, there was supposed to be nothing. Sterile sand, the bottom of human history. McAvoy found the Clovis layer exactly where it should be. Fluted points, the whole assemblage. Textbook. So he kept going. A few inches lower, in places barely that, the sand gave up something else. Small quartzite blades, prismatic blade cores, unfluted points that didn't match the Clovis toolkit at all.
Not a stray flake, an assemblage. Somebody had sat in that spot, worked stone, and left. Think about the scale of that. This isn't a new horizon buried yards below the surface. It's a sliver of sand, no wider than 2 fingers. A gap that small was all that stood between the accepted consensus and an entirely new reality. That gap is exactly what the critics went after. When the charcoal from the lower level came back from the lab, the numbers landed somewhere between 15,000 and 18,000 years old, thousands of years before Clovis. A second, separate excavation at the same site, run by Michael Johnson of the Archaeological Society of Virginia, found the same pattern independently. 2 teams, same dune, same result. Then came the response, and it went straight for the weakest point. Bioturbation. It's the single most powerful objection you can raise against a site like this. Bioturbation is what living things do to soil. Tree roots pushing down through it, burrowing animals moving it, insects working it constantly over thousands of years in loose sand. Small objects can migrate downward quietly with nothing to stop them.
So the critics argued something simple and honestly reasonable. There's no earlier layer at Cactus Hill. There's one layer, Clovis, and some of its stone has drifted a few inches down through sand that could never have held it in place. You haven't found older people. You've found gravity. I'll be honest, that's the argument I'd have made too. Everything about a sand dune says the layers should be scrambled. Nothing about that site should have stayed in order. Which is why what happened next is the most interesting part of the story. There's a way to test sand itself, and it has nothing to do with charcoal or artifacts. It's called optically stimulated luminescence, and it measures the last time a grain of sand saw sunlight. Bury a grain, and it starts quietly accumulating a signal from natural radiation in the ground. Expose it to light, and the signal resets to 0. So you can take the dune apart layer by layer and ask each one when it was buried. At Cactus Hill, the answers came back in order. Oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top.
The layers stacked in the sequence they should be if nothing had ever churned them. The dune had been building slowly and steadily, and it had stayed put. That doesn't settle the argument completely, Skeptics point out that luminescence dates the sand, not the stone sitting in it, and the association between the two is exactly what's being disputed. But it moved the site from implausible to genuinely difficult to dismiss. That's why Cactus Hill is still cited today, rather than quietly forgotten. It's worth picturing the place, because once you do, the dune explains itself. A high, sandy rise above a bend in the Nottoway. Dry, well-drained, sitting above the floodline, with a river below full of fish and a clear view of anything coming down to drink. It was a good place to camp. 18,000 years ago, and still a good place to camp when Clovis hunters turned up.
People simply kept returning to the same sensible spot on the river, sat down, worked a bit of stone, and left a little of it behind each time. Between the visits, the wind kept quietly laying down sand on top of them. The dune isn't really a site, it's a stack of ordinary afternoons. There's one more thing I have to mention, because leaving it out would be dishonest. Those small blades caught the attention of researchers who thought the technology resembled European stone tools from the same era and argued for a crossing of the North Atlantic. It became a famous idea. It's also not supported by the genetic evidence. Ancient DNA from the earliest Americans points to Asia consistently. The blades at Cactus Hill are real. The story some people built on top of them isn't. Since then, the ground has shifted underneath the whole argument. Monte Verde in Chile was accepted. Footprints at White Sands, New Mexico were dated by 4 separate methods to more than 20,000 years ago. Cactus Hill stopped being an outrage and became a data point. And here's the part that stays with me. That dune was a working commercial sand operation the entire time. While the argument was going on, trucks were still leaving. Part of Cactus Hill has been dug up, sold, and spread on somebody's building site, and no one will ever know what was in it. The Archaeological Conservancy eventually secured a portion of the site, so a piece of it is protected now. But only a piece. The rest went out on the back of a lorry.
Somewhere out there, under a quarry, under a road cut, under a gravel pit nobody thinks twice about, there's more of this story sitting in loose sand, waiting for someone to look before the machinery gets there. If you found this fascinating, hit subscribe for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.